Edgy, I was just saying to my colleagues here, you know you've made it in life when even the person who's introducing you is so deserving of an introduction. So it's that says a little something. But I did want to make a point even before that. One of the reasons we wanted to have Dr. Kaberuka here is that throughout his tenure as head of the African Development Bank, those of us who worked on the law and development side of things, we were always quite aware that Dr. Kaberuka, unlike some at that level, was always, we were aware that he was conscious of the nexus between governance and law and economic development and growth. So I just want to say sort of thank you for pushing those issues while you were at the African Development Bank. But first of all, I would like to introduce Sheila Khama, who's currently the practice manager at the World Bank's Energy, Extractive Industries, and Global Practice. But she previously worked at the African Development Bank, where she set up and ran a very interesting unit called the African Natural Resources Center. Again, something that I like about Sheila is that she is not just someone who has risen through the world of development, but she has been a real business person with a career in both banking and mining, and among other things was, I guess, the CEO of De Beers, Botswana. So someone with a very interesting sort of history as an executive in a very significant industry in the development space. So Sheila, please.
Can you hear me? Yeah, I guess you can. So I'm going to step down here. So good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for your audience. I have the privilege to introduce somebody that doesn't need introduction, so I struggled with what I would tell you without stating the obvious, so I thought I'd tell him what I think of him, since I've not had a chance. When I think of Dr. Kaberuka, I think of somebody who is two things. One, a patriot, and two, a visionary. Dr. Kaberuka has an obsession for all matters relating to development, but particularly development of the African continent. And it was no coincidence that he ended up as the executive chairperson of the African Development Bank. What did he do at the African Development Bank? He did the usual thing that CEOs do, but he did three things that come to mind when I think of his leadership and his vision. First of all, from a law and regulatory perspective, he recognized the importance of two things. One, that Africa, being well endowed with natural resources, needed to have a very robust governance framework, but not just one that was robust, but one that took account of the needs and the capacity needs specifically in legal terms of African governments, and set up what is now the legendary African Legal Support Facility. And legendary because this institution does quite a lot to support African countries negotiate, but also improve the substance of what is negotiated between extractive companies and others, and African governments. He also invited me, and I was quite flattered by this because I wasn't sure I was deserving. But he recognized that the law, the letter of the law alone is inadequate to ensure maximum returns from Africa's natural resources. He understood also that the policy framework and the, if you wish, ecosystem around which natural resources are developed is equally important, and he put this together. But in the area of rule of law and business, he also set up the Africa 50, which is a private sector entity. And this private sector entity is unique in one respect, in that actually is one of the few financial institutions that actually helps entrepreneurs structure projects. And in the small business space, this is one of the most difficult things, is to find finance at inception space. And he, as a visionary, recognized this and added this component to the suite of services that Africa 50, which is a subsidiary of the African Development Bank based in Morocco, does. And so it's my great privilege to invite Dr. Kabaruka to speak for himself about these things and why the importance of the nexus between rule of law and SMEs and the importance of development. So over to you, Dr. Kabaruka. We look forward to your wisdom. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Good. So I'll copy Sheila and I'll go to the podium. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Sheila, for those kind words. I'm not sure I'm so deserving, but thank you so much nonetheless. I think the work at African Development Bank was very much a collective exercise. I was only just leading the team and getting the praise. But anyway, I wanted to begin by pointing out three things. Today, if you go to Somalia, up to a few months ago, there was no government. So the basics of a state, rule of law, regulations, did not exist. So Somalia is not for the faint-hearted. So if you're looking for the kind of things you're used to, please keep away from Somalia. But talk to people who have been to Somalia. It is amazing how people doing business in the field of telecommunication, soft drinks, livestock, have made so much money in Somalia. Business runs very well. So high risks, high returns. Now I want you to reflect on what this means for the kind of things we're discussing, because the proposition that rule of law, governance, institutions is what you need for business prosper is not controversial one. So I don't plan to spend too much time on that. But I want to pivot this around the things you are taught in law schools or in business schools. That in trying to make a policy to bring about a particular outcome, so you have got the three hierarchies. Number one, those policies must be technically sound. That is not very difficult. You hire experts like yourselves, consultants, smart staff. They can figure out in a whole constellation of policies what are those that are technically sound for the kind of problem you are dealing with. In this case, small businesses, which, as you know, are the engines of employment all over the world. 65% of GDP of employment in rich countries, small businesses, however defined, because the definition is different. So the first level is that those policies must be technically sound. And I believe it is not very difficult. But there's a second level, and that is they must be technically sound, but they have also to be politically feasible. And political feasibility encompasses a number of things. They must be financially affordable, they must be timely, in terms of sequencing, in terms of phasing, all those things. It's useless having perfectly sensible policies, but which are not politically feasible at that point in time. So that's the second level of how to think around these policies. The third level, and this is what I brought in Somalia, is about, so you have gone from technical feasibility, technical sound, politically feasible, but they must also be administratively deliverable. It's about execution. I mentioned this, sir, because as head of the African Development Bank, I've looked through the rules and regulations of many of our countries. There is nothing in there which I can object to in terms of promoting small businesses. Absolutely nothing. There could be a gap here to complete. There could be issues here and there. But when it comes to actually implementation of those regulations and rules, that is where there is a serious problem. And I want to put it to you that as you think through these issues, please go through those levels and identify within each ecosystem where actually is the impediment. Is it lack of technical policies? Is it political feasibility? It's about implementation, execution. Let me give you a simple example. Of course, small businesses face many problems. The first one of which, of course, that the country has to be stable and peaceful. If you're a small garage owner in Kaduna, or you own a small internet cafe in downtown Lagos, you want a stable, peaceful environment. That is plain vanilla. And that's an issue for many of them. Two, you want to be in a place where the macroeconomic environment is reasonably sensible. Not yo-yos in currencies every other day, or having 5 exchange rates because you are reluctant to allow a market clearing rate of exchange, as was the case in one African country recently. You want to ensure that there are no rent seekers who will actually compete you out in a small procurement. So those things we know. It's not very difficult. But I've seen the biggest challenge for small businesses around access to finance and how to bring innovation around the collateral for small businesses who don't own much assets. And the countries I was looking at, the policies exist, how to encourage financial innovation, financial inclusion, how to encourage banking that bank, the kind of stuff, you know. But when it came actually to executing those policies, whether at central government level, municipal level, to government level, that's where the issues are. And so the first point I want to put to you is that Somalia, things have happened because, and now I know this is a controversial proposition, there was no big bureaucracy, set of regulations, tons of rules to stand in their way. Now, that will work up to a point, of course, at which point then you need rules of the game. But I'm saying to you that it's so well to have tons of rules which either end up being unexecuted or being an impediment to small businesses. And so, in the country I come from, for example, when we're looking at the income taxes, we decided that the small businesses defined as a particular level will pay something called a presumptive tax. Now, presumptive, meaning that we shall assume that if you are in the internet cafe business, you must be making a turnover of so much. So we just assume, all right? And it's a number. Now, it might be too high. But if you think it too high, then go and do the returns. All right? But the way it was calculated, probably it was in the right space. And a small business calculated that the transactions involved, the complexity of going to fill the forms are not worth them opting out of presumptive tax. Simple, it worked for them. So I want to put you that in many of these low-income countries, laws might be very good, regulation might be perfect, but if they are too complicated, too complex, then they'll come against the issues of execution or becoming an impediment to the development of business. That is the first proposition I want to put to you. Or at least we know exactly what it takes. We know the importance of SMEs. If you're looking for inclusion today in Africa, which is the biggest issue, how to grow the economies in an inclusive way, we know there are two big elephants in the room. One is small businesses, and especially the second, women-owned small businesses. That is the way you bring about inclusion. The third big one, where I think we're making very good progress, is bringing all girls and boys into quality education. Those are the three big instruments of inclusion. So we know what to do. But I hope in a conference like this, you can reflect on how actually bring into a sweet spot these three areas. Technical sound regulations, which are politically feasible, which can be executed without becoming an impediment themselves to small businesses or being unexecutable. If you do that, I think you can enable us to make huge progress in the things we're trying to do. The second point I want to make was that long time ago, I would say up to mid-80s, the really two biggest impediments to business were, number one, issues around property rights. Confiscation, nationalization, that kind of stuff. I think in Africa, many of these things are now part of history, except in one country, legacy issues. In other countries where, as Sheila was saying, contracts are negotiated. And along the way, one party, usually the government, feels, rightly or wrongly, that these contracts were biased. And therefore they want to go back to renegotiate them, or even worse, to renege on those contracts in parts or in full. So that is still an issue to deal with. The second issue businesses had when the domain of macroeconomic stabilization. But I think there we have made a lot of progress. There are bits of issues here and there, but I think many countries are managing their currencies very well. The central banks are relatively independent. The monetary policy is conducted as per orthodoxy. I think we are doing better than Europeans on that one. But I do think that with the exception of the challenges oil exporting countries have had in recent months, on balance, the macroeconomic issues have been resolved. But we are now having to do with the second level impediments. One of them is the one we're discussing. What type of regulations, what type of environment which meets the three criteria I've just enunciated. And then the second one, which is much more difficult, and this brings me to Africa 50, is around infrastructure. Think of a single mother owning an internet cafe in downtown Lagos, and that's the income to feed the family. So if there's power outages for half the day, all right? Or a young man with a garage repairing cars, there's power outages for the day. That's it. That defines the ability to get some money back home or even to pay the loans. So there are some basics we have to address. And the reason we set up Africa 50 was a recognition that governments cannot have enough money to resolve the infrastructure gap in Africa, which businesses, large and small, need. It's just not possible. So that is at least a fact, because we know the gap. Technologies begin to help, especially on solar power, as the cost of technology comes down, both for battery and for the panels. So that is helping a lot in terms of access to energy off grid. But we still have got a huge gap, which have to be resolved if we are to help the small business. There's no point in having a good architecture of laws if, in fact, there's no power, the garage won't function. And so when we're thinking about this Africa 50, which is basically an instrument for attracting private capital into the infrastructure space by, first of all, preparing the projects, you bring them to bankability, you market them, you co-invest with private capital. That is basically what was meant to do. It is not easy. All institutions are trying. But we think we can get it right to a point where private capital, where the money is, feels comfortable enough to invest in infrastructure as an asset class, which gives a return, liquidity, and security, the kind of things they're looking for. But this is a space, I think, which going forward will be critical for your profession. You know, right now, the World Bank is looking for a capital increase. But even if they get a capital increase, the level of remittances today in the world are a multiple of the capital of the World Bank. Money now is in the private markets, more than at any time in recent history. So the role of financial institutions, especially IFIs like World Bank, IFC, ADB, is now to figure out how to make it possible for private capital to be attracted to the asset classes which we want to invest in, so helping businesses, large and small. Now, I know for a long time we thought PPPs, is that what they call them? PPPs were the solution. But believe me, I saw, one time I asked my legal officers to just take a look at one of them. It was 400 pages. I don't know if anybody outside the legal department read them, or if they read them, I doubt if they understood them. So think now of a poor government, the government of Guinea-Bissau, trying to negotiate a PPP for power for the country. It is not easy. So PPPs will work, but they're not a panacea. But again, here I think we'll have to figure out, are there ways in which you can make this accessible to a government with limited capabilities? Almost every single government, when I was in office, was saying to me, can you give us a model PPP on which we can operate? Now, my training is in economics. I'm not a lawyer. But my inkling feeling was such a model PPP cannot exist. That was my inkling. It's like saying, I have got malaria, give me a model pill for malaria. Because every patient is different. The doctor may prescribe the same pill, but in different ways, a different combination depending upon what you have. So I imagine a PPP for Guinea-Bissau would not be the same for the city of Johannesburg and so on. But maybe there is a basic, maybe it exists in your profession, sir, but I never saw one, where you can say, oh, government want to negotiate a bridge in Abidjan, here's a PPP, sign on it, and move on. But there is demand for those kind of services at the moment. So outside natural resources, leveraging private capital and PPPs, I think these are the challenges will be in the future. So those are the 3 points I wanted to mention. Now, I'm not sure whether I have answered your question, but I want to go back to say that if you can help us these 3 areas, you would have done a lot for small businesses, but also for large businesses, because the two work together anyway. You cannot have a ghetto of small business, big businesses. Again, as I say, if I look at my own country now, the explosion in small businesses in the IT space, people employing 3, 4, 6 people, and the kind of service they provide to large businesses, how they brought down the cost of doing business, makes me think that they are small, but actually they can have a huge multipliers, even for the large businesses. So thank you. I'm happy to answer your questions.
Yeah.
Point to somebody else take this.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Kabaruka. I'm going to exercise the prerogative of the moderator, if I may, and ask the first question. And I'm intrigued by the example of Somali, because in my observation, Somali probably represents a picture that is not unique, albeit perhaps extreme. And so if we think that there they are trading, they're getting on with their business, despite the confusion, what is this telling us about the relevance of the same state apparatus about which you speak in some countries? Is there a level at which in some countries the state is at risk of becoming irrelevant? And if so, how do we make sure that we maintain that entrepreneurship in that state of irrelevance, and how do we turn the situation around that the state starts to function so that you get the best of both worlds, a thriving business that is not startled by an incompetent or irrelevant state, but then a state that recovers and falls in line and becomes relevant and does the three things that you spoke about. Thank you.
No, I want to be clear. I mentioned Somalia just to excite your mind. The lack of a state in Somalia is a temporary window which is ending, by the way, now. I was just trying to exaggerate the problem of having very good laws, which are technically sound, when the other two elements are not in place. So, for example, people have told me, they export millions of livestock to the Middle East through the three ports in Somalia. The bureaucracy they have to go through is almost nil. But try exporting live animals from an organized state, maybe somewhere else. You may have to go through 10 applications, phytosanitary, customs, security. So there is a cost to all that. So I was exaggerating. I don't think Somalia can be, please don't misunderstand me. I was only saying that regulations have to be not necessarily light touch or heavy touch as you are doing here in the US, but they have to reflect the capacity of the government, the administration, to actually carry them through without becoming an impediment to the small businesses themselves. It was the only point I was making. But I tell you, one time I put in a call to the president of Somalia. I was then in Tunis or Abidjan. It was clearer to call Mogadishu, right, than to call a city next door. Because telecommunications in Somalia got to work perfectly, all right? They don't have all these hindrances which many other people have. But I want to be clear. I'm not saying that that is the ideal situation. It's not a temporary window anyway. So the Somalis became inventive. And if you know that what has kept Somalia going is not foreign aid, it is the $1.6 billion remittances from Somalis living abroad, Minneapolis, Sweden, London, and elsewhere. This one has kept the state going.
Thank you. Questions from the floor, please? Yes, we have a lady there. If you quickly just say who you are and fire away.
Hello, everybody. My name is Afyong, and I'm from Nigeria. For Dr. Kaberuka, I wanted to ask, in your time in the ADB, did you experience situations where you were prevented from making investments, maybe large infrastructure investments, because of unclear regulation or regulation that clearly had vested interests, which sort of prevented you from investing in a particular asset or whatever? And if you were able to get around that, what were some of the things? Basically, how did some of your conversations with top-level government officials go to try sort of, iron out maybe unclear regulation for the greater good of society? I don't know if my question is clear.
So let me try to explain the specific nature of institutions like the World Bank and ourselves. Because we're not just an ordinary investor. When we invested, we had a couple of objectives, and you have to look at how you get a sweet space. Number one, you want to make sure that the money is used for the purpose for which it is intended. So that is a fiduciary issue. So we have to make sure that conditions are in place for those fiduciary conditions to be respected. So many times, we are not able to close on that fiduciary issue. There was a risk that the money could be misused. So since we are custodians of public funds, we have to be careful. We don't go to that point. Then we deploy other instruments to help the country improve the fiduciary environment. Second objective, which we would have as a DFI, we want to get results. Now, in the case of private investment, those results would be defined probably in a space of 3 issues. Number one, they have to be what we call development impact. hard to measure, but you have to figure out by some metrics whether we're getting impact. Number two, whether we're bringing something called additionality. So, for example, if there was a possibility that we could crowd out a local bank able to do the same things, then not bring additionality would then pull back. And of course, the third element would be risk. Normal. Risk is measured by normal metrics. So there have been many cases where one or a combination of those issues weren't in place and we had to pull back.
Thank you. Another question, please, or comment? You can disagree. Don't let Dr. Kaberuka get off easy.
Absolutely.
Please, Stuart.
Actually, again, thanks, Dr. Kaberuka, for coming out. Stuart Kerr from here at Jones Day. As you referenced, there are so many factors that impact the success or failure of SMEs that are in some ways addressed by the lending policies of the IFIs. Power is so necessary. The regulatory environment, which is kind of a focal area for us today. Looking back on your time at the African Development Bank and thinking about other IFIs, are there areas that and speaking to other donor agencies represented here, technical assistance providers and so forth, are there areas that you think are currently being insufficiently addressed that might benefit by further attention pertaining to SMEs that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think we need to think hard, all of us, in the legal profession, the financial world, about the collateral differently. Because if you are like this young man here, you live in Cotonou, you go to the bank looking for a loan, the chance will ask you, do you have a house or a piece of land or something? Okay? But if you're an upcoming young man, bright, with a good idea, you're looking for just $100,000, and you have no collateral as defined nowadays. I know of only a few banks which are now getting it right. One of them is a Moroccan bank, which has financial products which are perfectly suited to even what they call in French, because here we're talking about SMEs. There's a word in French for not simply SMEs, but something below that.
Micro.
They call them in French les très petites entreprises. So they're not just small, they're like very small. Like it's like a young man or woman trading something in the market, maybe get 3,000 francs per day. Those banks have developed products for those kind of people. I think the DFIs and governments working together to try to improve on how you collateralize all those things could make a huge difference. That is my feeling. Lending to SMEs at that level is not very easy. So what we did usually was to provide funding to local institutions, hoping then they would pass on innovation to the SMEs, and they never did. Instead, they passed on inefficiencies and high costs. They passed on complex products, so that was one. Or they developed forms of the traditional, the much celebrated microfinance, which I think has had its day. So I don't think we got it right, but I think the kind of risk instrument we have in these DFIs is not working for SMEs.
Yes, please, ma'am. You can. Yes, of course.
Hello, my name is Andrea Marušić from the World Bank. So I have a question related to Rwanda, which is kind of the poster child of ease of doing business reforms in Africa and has been consistently top reformer in our annual doing business report. So we know what Rwanda did well, but what do you think it didn't do well and should do in terms of improving its environment for SMEs, if anything?
Okay, so I'm knowing a minister for the government of Rwanda, so you'll have to ask the officials. But I can just give you an expert view. First of all, I think they did right. And Stuart, I want your protection here in terms of
Chatham rules.
Chatham rules. Many African countries at independence inherited civil service, public services, fonction publique, which is okay for European countries, but perfectly dysfunctional for our countries. You know, we copied the model from Whitehall or from Napoleonic model from France, public service. And over time, people like the World Bank and ourselves worked through many projects of reforming the public service. We're still reforming the public services. I think what Rwanda got right was that instead of reforming the public services, it created something sui generis. To ask the question, what kind of public service do we need for a country at our level of development? So the ecosystem you have there is not your typical civil service. I think the other country I can think about, which has developed its own model of government, would be New Zealand. Some of you can look at New Zealand. New Zealand does not have ministries with the department, with another department. You have ministers and just a government. So I think the one thing Rwanda got right was to invite, to imagine, to reinvent. So a core public service around which you have got some executive agencies, including the Rwanda Development Board. It's the one which developed many of these instruments to make easy for business. So that is what I think is a key issue. The reason I want to be a protection is that civil servants are very powerful people. And I think they will take offense at this retired president saying how unuseful the civil services are. What now we must do to the next level is that ranking doing business is fine. Many African countries are trying hard. But now we have to go to the next stage, which is the microeconomic level, the kind of things we're discussing, collateral for small businesses, what kind of training you give, entrepreneurship, the kind of things which make small business take advantage of that environment. And we being a landlocked country, 1,800 kilometers from the sea, you can imagine that people are looking at so what kind of businesses develop when you are so far away from the sea. And that is a big impediment because it raises the cost almost by 40%.
Bear with me. I'm going to just comment on what Dr. Kaberuka said, because actually what you're saying about the importance of self-determination and not assuming that just because it has worked elsewhere that it will work, or that it has to be copied because it has worked, is very important. And I've seen in the area of mining, the artisanal mining space, which in Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, this is a traditional way of business. However, when many of the governments created laws de facto to govern mining, they governed from a mechanized mining Western legal framework perspective. The unintended consequences that they illegalized an entire business sector that had been thriving for centuries, and nobody in that room had the presence of mind to say, it works, it's not broken, don't fix it. And so now it is truly broken. And now we see artisanal mining as a problem, but actually it is the laws that gave no regard to this status quo that have now created a problem. And now yours truly and others are trying to go back 100 years ago to create that existed. And I think the moral of the tale there is, let's not assume as we ponder these challenges that models that work for others must necessarily be our point of departure. So please, I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very good to listen to Dr. Kaberuka. I've heard a lot about you, and it's a very insightful presentation. My name's Jeffrey Kiriabwire. I'm a judge or justice of the Court of Appeals of Uganda and former head of the Commercial Court in Uganda. And You have spoken very passionately about the lessons that you saw at the African Development Bank, the interface between regulation and business development, the challenges of contract enforcement with the triple Ps and all of this. But I have the sense that one of the areas that has not been looked at, and I may be wrong, and I'd like to hear your take on this, is the support to dispute resolution. You talked about support to infrastructure, but I don't really see sense of support to dispute resolution, improving access to the courts for the MEs and even the informal sector. And we also know, obviously, that this is also not an area that is well funded by the government. Don't you think that development banks and other agencies should also step in trying to make this area more efficient and effective? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justice. You know, it was an omission on my part. When I was talking about Rwanda, this one thing I should have mentioned. The commercial courts, arbitration centers, which are funded by a couple of IFIs. You're absolutely right. Any country which does that, I mean, takes a huge burden off, not simply small business, by the way, even banks, as they recover their collateral from other big lenders. Yes, you're right. But I want to end by saying this, as many of you are lawyers, maybe I should stand so I can say this.
Of course.
You know, during the financial crisis, we learned quite a lot. And in a speech I was making somewhere, I said, look, the world of finance is a bit like traffic management. All of us know the regulations up front, or we should know them. So that is one part. Heavy, light, we know them, the regulations. If you want to drive on a highway, you know the rules. But that was not enough. Now there have to be supervision for those rules. Traffic policemen, in this case bank controllers, but from the organs which do that. But even that is not enough. There have to be a sanctions regime which is implemented. So if you do an accident, there will be someone to send you a big bill or even lock you up. Now, all three, during the financial crisis, things went wrong at different levels, as you know very well. But there was something else which went wrong. So beyond regulations up front, which you know, beyond supervision, sanctions, there's what we call resolution. In this case, of course, in the financial crisis, resolution at some point was socialized. Taxpayers had to pay for behaviors of people who are in charge of any point at this level. So what I want to add, because relevant for the business environment, sir, is about doing the right things, not simply having a battery of laws and regulations. That is what we call doing the right things. You can call it what you want, ethics in business, you can call it, I don't know, there's some other definitions. But I think laws, regulations are fine. But it's something we call doing the right things. And that cannot be defined, codified by law. It has to be developed in some ways. And I would hope that in a conference like this, you can also reflect a bit of what I call beyond the law, beyond the regulations, an environment which enables business to thrive. It's a point I thought to make, but I had forgotten. Thanks.
How much more time do we have? Just one more. Okay. Oh, yes, please. You have the last to say.
On the way.
While we approach the next question, thank you, Dr. Kaberuka. I'm writing a book, as you know, and one of the chapters is called Doing the Right Thing. So thank you for, for reaffirming. Please, madam.
Good morning. I'm Ulimata from the International Center, current Mo Ibrahim Leadership Fellow. Given the importance of the informal sector in Western Africa, what should our governments do to help these informal companies become formal? Where do you think they should focus more in order to adapt the regulations and also at the same time be able to capture the tax they need? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very important question, sir.
Yeah. No, I think I'll let you guys discuss that here. But there's a whole range of things you can do, which you know very well. But if I was to pick up one, just one, I think it is the role of not governments as we understand them, things like local councils, municipal authorities, and so on. Because often the taxation you mentioned are not taxation for the central government. They are collected by local councils, municipal councils, and so on. And it's amazing, you could find the same little trader selling chicken or garage has got maybe about 7 different rates to pay. All right? Now, for a large business, it's already a problem. But think of this small trader having to pay a rate for one thing, a tax for another, something for the municipality, for the local government. I think some simplification of the fiscal situation would be extremely helpful. That is one. Number two, I gave the example of the Moroccan bank. Because many of the banks in Africa, as Sheila was saying, develop their business from the European model. They come, they set up in the middle of the city, they service import exports and the big customers. They never develop products suitable, appropriate for those kind of business you're mentioning. So again, the challenge here is nowadays known as financial inclusion. How to develop products suitable for those kind of businesses. By the way, they're prepared to pay. I've been amazed at looking at fishermen or fisherwomen. At the end of the day, they woke up this little bank, they deposit the little money they had, all right? Because they trust this bank will not ask them tons of things, tons of papers, and you'll have products for them. So for me, simplification of the fiscal situation for those businesses, by the local authorities, and then all of us trying to help the banks get out from their pedestal and get down to service the people, because there's money to be made there. This Moroccan bank, whose name I can't mention, of course, because they have not paid me to do publicity for them, but you can research. It's a bank which has done wonders for very, very small businesses, including the informal sectors.
Well, with those few words, I now take the opportunity to thank you very much, Dr. Kaberuka, for your time and your wisdom. I'm mindful that you have, for the last decade and more, kept the counsel of Africa's leadership and world leaders, and that in many ways your words here are giving us a window into also the psyche of those leaders, what they struggle with and what they could, we should endeavor to help them with. I also want to thank the audience for your time and your indulgence. I hope that you have found this thought-provoking and wish you well with the rest of the program. It has been a privilege to be with you. Good afternoon.